Hi, my name is John Butler, an entrepreneur here in St. John's, and I'm helping out a good friend of mine, Grant Genova, who's a local architect in St. John's and really focused on urban planning and urban design. And first, apologize for any wind. It's a crazy windy day, although it's like 20, 25 degrees out. Wind tends to be our downfall. Anyway, I'm here on Hayward Avenue, downtown St. John's, just in front of Georgetown Bakery. And Grant is going to take us on a Jane's Walk, which is hosted by Happy City St. John's. For anyone that doesn't know already, Jane's Walks happen around the world every May in celebration of Jane Jacobs, who was an American-Canadian journalist, author, and activist who influenced urban studies, sociology, and economics. And this year's Jane's Walks had been hosted throughout the month of May by Happy City St. John's, which, for those, again, that don't know, is a nonprofit organization that informs, encourages, and facilitates public dialogue around the city, civic issues in the city of St. John's. So basically, that's what we're going to do today. So I'll hand it over to Grant. Mostly what you're going to see throughout this walk is just a tour of our little, what we're called hidden stroll throughout St. John or downtown St. John's. So Grant's going to lead a lot of that conversation. I'll more or less be the guy trying to throw some questions out there, learning a little bit more about the city, because there's a lot of it that's new to me. So Grant, I'll let you take it over. Maybe introduce yourself, talk a little bit about some of the other work that you do.
I want to talk about Jane Jacobs. We've been doing these walks regularly, and a lot of times we don't really understand the person that is really, the person responsible for causing us to be so aware. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of background on Jane. She wrote 7 books, all in and around urban problems. The most famous one, of course, is The Death and Life of the Great American City, or Cities. She was born in 1916, and one of the key 2 comments that she made in her life was, and she was quoted many times for this, but it was eyes on the street, like we need to look, and social capital. Those are phrases that she coined. Her main efforts, why she came to the urban problem, was because of Robert Moses, who was a powerful individual, actually was named the master builder of New York City. And although he did some amazing things in his career, towards the end of his career, he was really destroying certain aspects of New York. Jane Jacobs was part of the beatnik kind of generation. She and her husband, who actually was an architect, very early had their home in Greenwich Village. And she was very linked to that kind of lifestyle, even though at this particular period of time was the beginning of suburbia. And she and her husband chose to be more in the fabric of New York City. And she really was entering into a very male-dominated field of urban planning, and was actually not trained that way. Where she started, actually, she was a writer for the Office of War Information, and her husband during World War II he couldn't find a job as an architect, although he was a Columbia educated architect out of Columbia University, but he was designing, it's going to sound peculiar, he was designing warplanes. And one very interesting thing about Jane, because I feel, she's a different generation than me, but if there's anyone that's responsible for making architects be responsible to social concerns, it's definitely her. She just basically explains that to respect, in the deepest sense, strips of chaos that have weird wisdom of their own, not yet encompassed in our concept of urban order. It's a quite detailed comment, but basically what she's trying to say is some of these designs that are done, which are insensitive, you need to really look at your neighborhood well And just because it doesn't necessarily look like it belongs in Dwell magazine or something like that, it's something to be respected and worked with. So we can go on the walk. Georgetown was actually St. John's first suburbia. The initial thing that happened in Georgetown was actually supposedly George the farmer. This was farmland, and what happened was people would have their separate, a secondary house, a cottage of some sort, on a fairly large piece of property, but that was the place where they went and grew their vegetables and things of that sort during the summer months. So St. John's starts that way. It's got this central core, and its first suburbia is Georgetown. What happens, though, is the fires occur, which one was in 1846, another one in 1892, and they had to react very fast to that particular problem because there was a lack of housing. And so that's where you get what I call the vernacular architecture that we now actually work on as our image of St. John's, the small houses, the clapboard, the houses compressed up against the street and so forth. And in some cases, a good example in the picture right now is the yellow and red one. That actually is a project by Robert Mellon, who is a well-known architect in St. John's and has written a few books about Newfoundland architecture. And you don't even realize that his addition is the red piece, and the original building itself was the yellow piece. And that's very much our style or our history of architecture in St. John's. Now, to talk about the pathways that are all around Georgetown, and actually we're going to be going all the way down to the harbor. There are actually there's not a social concern nor we'll call it a social mandate that comes from the city to start protecting these areas. And my thing about this is that if we don't start doing that in a logical way, as we'll see on this walk, people, because of their own personal territories of their backyard or whatever, start encroaching on what really is public space. Luckily, this area here that we're looking at, which supposedly the bumps in the ground are buried cars, that's what local people have told me. But this is a space, at least during the summer, that they have group activities. The one thing that has to start happening, though, is that these spaces, maybe they can get some lighting, maybe they can get pieces of sculpture, art type projects, murals, things that make it more than what we're seeing here, which is just an open space. And what's really interesting about these types of urban spaces that are totally focused on the empowering the pedestrian is that it's a different way of walking through the neighborhood and a different way of connecting to your neighborhood. And in a lot of cases, there's shortcuts.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, you never know what kind of way you can, set up that space, and another entryway just to here. And yeah. I guess as we walk through, you can see another entry point. So you got these three areas where, depending on where you are coming into this space, that you can come in through separately.
Yeah, and realize these places were created by the movement of people, the general, and of course, when you're maneuvering yourself through any urban type fabric, especially in the old days, you're on foot. So you're going to go the paths of least resistance. And there was probably a lot more paths out of that central space than there is today. Today, they've been encroached on or actually removed. And it's getting to a point that you wouldn't want all of them removed because it takes away from the actual history. But at the same time, these are actual paths that can be used today They need to be enhanced, though. Now, as we go up this area, another, like putting together an understanding of urban fabric, you got to have some sort of keywords or whatever you want to call them. And some of the keywords are paths, edges, districts, nodes, landmarks, things like this. And one of the two key people that actually allow us to sort of understand this a little bit better, there's a great book by Kevin Lynch called Image of a City. And he talks in that book about actually the city of Boston and how, cities have image, that they have their own image, just like a person's face in a sense, but far more complex. And there's another book by Christopher Alexander that talks about pattern language. And that was a method of describing good design practices or patterns of useful organization. And you see this as you walk along, like the little park that is over to the left of Mellon's house. Yeah, that was an original site of a house, but at least the city decided to make what one would call a node or a place to rest or something of that. Again, more can happen in these areas than what we even see here if it became more of an initiative to empower the pedestrian. And I don't mean just planting, I mean more like out of the drizzle or something of that sort. More outside environment, kind of like embracing the way our weather works. I'm not absolutely sure about this, but this feels like this used to be a pathway at one time. And it's been completely fenced off. You can't get through this anymore. It goes somewhere. But
yeah, it goes to the back of someone's house.
Yeah. And this is just things that happen over time because an owner will decide to move his fence over. You should be across on the other side of the street because I wanted to, that blue building there, talk about the...
Oh, this one here.
Yeah,
I'll cross the street, Steve.
Okay, and then after that is the other path. Yeah, this is an interesting thing because there's many examples in experience in my career where people will want to tear down something because it just doesn't quite fit or it looks odd or something of that sort. What's really unique about these buildings like this one is that if you just let it be for a while, it's actually going to become a jewel because it's weird and it's odd. And in the long run, that's the kind of stuff that actually has more power historically. And so this was a hodgepodge of activity of a family, trying to make ends meet, basically, probably. And it shouldn't be looked at as an eyesore. And I think that emphasizes some of what Jane Jacobs was trying to get people to understand. It's not just, you don't create urbanism by pretty pictures. You have to look inside it. You have to scratch the surface a little bit to understand what a really good city is. Now, see, if we were doing an actual walk, there would be chatter of the people, and that's where there's a silence here.
Well, it's
hard
just
to,
interesting because the weirdness factor of how that peak kind of sticks its nose out.
Yeah, that's true.
But so here we're just coming down another one of those hidden trails that lead into, what once was something different.
Right. And you're going past edges that have disrepair, things that have fallen into the walkway. And in this particular case, this was a total natural vegetation walk type way, but the open we'll call it that open court, or that larger space, has now become a parking lot. And yeah, the question now is where do we stay with the parking lot for a minute, John? Like, some of the challenges that we've got now in terms of how we want to use our cities and making them more livable is, how do we take care of separating the car and empowering the pedestrian? It can't be like, in this particular decision, it was just, I need to be able to park in front of my building or something of that sort. And there's got to be a balance of those two things for a city to become more livable and more usable. It can't be totally taken over by the automobile.
No, it's interesting though, because throughout this, even some of our chatter earlier, just looking at spaces that, again, were green at one point where people gathered. I know you're going to talk about one a little bit later too, that were completely changed to support people to park.
Exactly.
And again, back to the idea of like walkability. You know, if it's easy to just park right in front of where it is that you want to go, then why would anyone want to walk anywhere?
Right.
We got lots of dogs going anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know this little nook was my favorite, or is my favorite, just in between houses. You barely have enough room to walk. And it's kind of hidden behind a car.
Oh yeah.
Public space.
This pathway is still here. It's a miracle that it is, to be honest. And it's being encroached on. I mean, you go through a very narrow, can hardly get your body through. And yet this was at least 6 feet wide at one time. Because we're on our way beyond this yellow building that you're seeing. We're on our way to the parking lot of the Basilica. John, if you can just turn around and look back at the pathway, because I wanted to talk about, there's public laneways, and they have already a legal right. It's like acquired rights for the public. A good example of this is when I first moved to Pooch Cove about 8 years ago now. I was helping a friend with a site survey, and on the original survey I saw this name of a road called Bank Road, and I just basically thought it meant Mr. Bank, or whatever, and the road was named after him. Then I noticed it on another one and another one. There was all these bank roads, and what they actually were, when the fishing stages, because Pooch Cove was a fishing village, when the fishing stages were put down on the rock on the sea, they were made up of all different families. And so the bank road was the way the community went down to the fishing stages. So it was a public thoroughfare, we'll call it. I brought this up to the city of Pooch Cove, that how come we're not protecting these? Because what was happening was people were actually building fences in front of the roadway, the old roadway, and kind of getting away with it. So we brought up the fact that it was the only way that we could, people that live we were just across the street from the ocean, but if you want to go and walk and stand right at the ocean edge or the rock edge, you couldn't, if this continued, you couldn't do this. The same thing happened in an abstract way in Florida when the condominiums are being placed on the beach, because the beach is a public space. No one owns it. The people own it. And so what would happen is all these condos go up and they block the way to get into the beach. And there was actual legal legislation passed where the condos had to provide land for portals to be able to access the beach. And the same thing holds true with all these pathways all over St. John's. they need to be supported, right, legally speaking, so that people can't encroach on them for their personal reasons. And it creates an immense, really adds to the walkability of a city if you continue to have these pathways.
And Grant, you were saying with I guess the home where the fence there with the gardens and whatnot that's coming into that pathway is just increasingly, stretching those limits, I guess, for their own property.
Yeah, and that is a community garden that's right along that. So it's got, we'll call it social empowerment, that it's a community garden, but all these pathways are for everybody, not just particular groups. And some of them, like this one, had to be fenced off so that it wouldn't, that it would remain strongly fenced off, like, with chain link fence. Okay, so now we're entering the parking lot of the Basilica. And I have to take people back in time on this. If you were part of St. John's and you were, number one, walking to church or riding your horse to church or riding a horse and buggy to church, this particular property was not configured like we see it today. It was much like a Versailles garden, if you've ever seen pictures of Versailles. It was formal. That archway that we see off in the distance there, you actually entered the site that way. That was how the pedestrian came in, and then you walked through it to get to different buildings, because all these buildings that are on the Basilica site have been there for ages. But now it's totally empowering the car and nothing else. And it's sort of sad, because at one time this was an amazing set of gardens, basically, that have been paved over. And so it becomes a bit of an obstacle, in a sense, for the pedestrian, because if this was filled with cars, you'd be maneuvering through the cars, much like we have to do at Stavanger, right, or places like that. And yet, when the developers were designing Stavanger, they said it was pedestrian friendly, and somebody believed it because they saw a sidewalk on the sketch, which is a lot more than just a sidewalk to make it pedestrian friendly. So this is the remnants of what was original, if you can just imagine, and a lot of planting and flowers, and because it was a very formal garden, and you entered the site that way. I guess this might be we're going to continue to walk down past common ground, and I want to stop at a site up the way here that's actually it's property that the Anglican Church owns, and they've got a development that's going to happen there. But before we do that, if you can just swing the camera around, John, and just look at just general kinds of. St. John's is really, it truly is like a medieval village, and its beginnings, because it's so old, is why we have our screwy streets. Someone that only thinks that life was big machinery and cars and trucks and buses and stuff, they don't understand that St. John's and the way it's configured was the easiest way to travel when you were walking or riding a horse. And so we've got the streets kind of twist and bend, and they make these peculiar shapes and they make peculiar shaped buildings. But now this is the language of our city, and it's truly unique that way. What's strange is the zoning rules and regulations do not support the original fabric or geometry of the city. And actually across Newfoundland, even in Pooch Cove, the properties that were the original properties are now called irregular, or they'll be called non-compliant. And it's peculiar because some of the design regulations, and these are design parameters that are thrown out by the city, goes right again. I mean, it would actually wipe out all the buildings in St. John's if they were followed. Luckily, they have acquired rights. My point is, why aren't we making our zoning to enhance what we know is the city, rather than really taking rules that come from places like Mississauga? And this is part of the struggle of trying to keep properties in the urban fabric of the city, keep them being reused, repurposed, and so forth. So
Grant,
go ahead.
I was just saying, like, what do you think in terms of how things are now? What are some things that you would recommend to, take positive action to restore, the types of things you're speaking about, the natural, I guess, infrastructure of the city, just on how it worked, instead of being ripped apart on how you see things now? Like, what are some suggestions, or what can people do?
Well, it's not an easy road to travel, but I do believe it's doable, and it takes a lot of like-minded people to get behind certain initiatives. I wanted to talk about I can talk about it when we go down the stairs and we're looking back. I can do it then. But I think some of the challenges are very specific. It's like there'll be a new development that wants to happen. Some developer wants to do something, and in general, there'll be supposedly engagement with the public, but in reality, I've been at this long enough, and I've been on both sides of that fence because I am a practicing architect. A lot of it, when you walk in and the project is already designed and already has a pretty picture and whatever, that's not engagement. Engagement is that you're really asking people specifically, what do they feel? And you're going to work off of those initial words of what they say, because not everybody's an architect, or not everybody's a graphic designer or whatever. So the style of engagement, actually the design of engagement, is extremely important. And we need to do more of developing how we're going to engage the public so that they can get their voice out there. Because there's too many when a property is at the level of this one, that there's supposedly some ideas going in this vacant, it's a huge vacant space that's behind that chain link fence. When properties are in the urban fabric like this one is, it's got responsibilities to much bigger things than just an individual building their own house. Any development going in here has to start addressing some key things that it has to meet. It has to meet some very important, what I call design parameters, that enhance city life. It has a responsibility to that. I'm not too sure that everyone believes that that's what's supposed to happen, because some of them will say, well, you're creating more regulations. Not if you got a whole group of people together and you're going to talk about urban problems and how the city has to become more livable. One of the key things that is very important in St. John's, and we kind of coined it a while back, but it's the idea that you're dealing with wind, fog, wind, rain. Yeah,
like right
fog,
now.
wind, yeah.
There were a couple
Fog
times when I wanted to come in and make a comment, but the wind was that
was too bad.
bad on Harbour
Yeah.
Road that I just
But
couldn't.
But we added another major factor. Like, in other words, all major projects in St. John's should embrace fog, wind, rain, and elevation. Elevation is a major thing. And there's even examples, like one that I sort of point to all the time is the TD building on Duckworth. It also is on water. It goes the whole way. The elevation difference between water and Duckworth is around 30 feet. That TD building allows you to have smooth accessibility, total inclusion, we'll call it. By walking into the TD building, you can go down an elevator and come out on water. The problem is that the people that did the building originally did not recognize that that was supposed to be a public space, similar to how Montreal Metro is, or something like that. They actually closed the building at 6 o'clock. A public space allows you to go through it. So the idea of solving problems when you're beginning a project with the parameter of elevation should be on the designer's table, not ignored. Now, we just walked through a major little park area, and this is an interesting park because it has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways to come into it and 4 different ways to go out. Again, all of these parks, there needs to be more effort put behind what the park is about. Like, there could be a mural in this park. There could be some better lighting, not necessarily overhead lighting, some more architectural type of lighting and things of that sort. And maybe a park bench or something of that. But pretty much most of these areas, most of these pedestrian areas in St. John's are ignored. And it comes from the people to create the initiative. It doesn't come from telling the city, for instance, these are important, what are you doing about it? Because we know that doesn't go anywhere. It's more like taking on an initiative that would grow over time to start supporting all these laneways that are part of the character of St. John's. So I think it really does come from the people. It doesn't come from city officials at all. It's very hard for them, working through all their regulatory quagmire, to even help at times, because the regulations are against the idea. But local like-minded people getting together, like Happy City, trying to support this idea of these laneways. We do it every year. Jane walks. That's what this is all about. We're on our way to another specific elevation problem, or pedestrian problem, for moving from one plateau of St. John's to another, and they're pretty dramatic. And this one is an old concrete stair. It's right up the way here, right after all the parked cars. Again, it's not very friendly. It's not really helping in any way, because in most cases, the staircase is a difficult thing to maneuver. And it's, on top of it, you can see it's broken concrete. Even the step up has been handled with this little funny ramp or whatever. And this in most of our weather is quite treacherous. I've brought up the fact a while ago that, for instance, a good example, and it's very historical, is Quebec City. Maybe most people don't realize it, but Quebec City there's Upper Quebec and Lower Quebec. And I'm talking about the area where it was walled in. There's an upper and a lower, and I think that drop is something like 50 feet. And they installed what is called a vehicular, like a way to make sure that Lower Quebec and Upper Quebec were equal, if nothing else for commerce or something of that sort. Well, there's some key areas of St. John's that I think they should invest money, especially when you talk about the idea of mobility, where we could have large platform escalators, which have radiant heat. So they're definitely taken care of for the winter and the drizzle. They're slightly enclosed with a little bit of a radiant cocoon. And it allows you to actually be able to walk all the way up to military without losing, I lose my breath. It's very difficult. And then when there's the weather that we have, it's even more difficult. If you're really trying to get the city to be more mobile and more pedestrian empowered, you've got to introduce these, I guess we would call them public works programs. Now we're going into a little area. It's a apartment complex. One thing I think the complex itself is really amazing, but John, if you turn the camera over towards the doors of one of the units. Yeah, it's hard to see, but what we really don't do a lot of in St. John's is work with that space that I call inside outside. It's very important that we kind of open up to this idea, and we've got the technologies to do it. Like we have radiant heat ability. We can put in canopies. We can make sure the snow doesn't collect or whatever. But even when these spaces were designed, which is supposedly a place, it's the only outdoor space that's really owned by the apartment, right? It's like your little patio. If you just arranged a few chairs in that space, it's very difficult to have any activity going on in there at all. And I think this is part of where we've got to open up to the idea that buildings are not only for inside use, they've got to start reaching out, even though we have the climate we have, because I think technically we can take care of that now. So there's a responsibility for all the designer types to actually take on that idea, which is this inside outside. It's that zone in between, because right now all we do is we're inside or we're outside, and that doesn't allow us to embrace the climate that we've got, because those ideas are not out there of how to handle that.
And Grant, I'm going to cross right through that little laneway now. I know initially we were going to head down in front of City Hall. I don't know if maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about it as I crossed.
No, it's okay. We can skip over and go down to try to get to George Street. Don't kill yourself, John. We don't need that on video. Yeah.
No, that'd be maybe a little bit.
Be careful. Be careful. Where we're going to go now is everyone is familiar with it, but we have a set of, actually they're named laneways that take us basically from this particular plateau that we're on right now and take us down through Duckworth, we're on Duckworth, through George Street, and then continue on down to Water. And even these laneways and pathways have been encroached by the bars to create outside patio space. And I don't mind that. There's give and take in territory of urban fabric, and people have got to make commerce. I'm not questioning that, but there is not enough going on to try to save. If you go down the continuation down to Blue on Water, the city allows encroachment on these laneways, and you see them they'll allow them to mount an air conditioner, and you could possibly impale your head on it. They allowed this staircase to go up to this patio, which what we're walking through is a public zone. And if you allow too many of these other functions to encroach on that public zone, the public zone itself gets constricted. At the same time, it's not being maintained properly. Yet this is one of the most unique things about downtown St. John's, is all those laneways that go all the way from, I think basically all the way from Prescott. Well, actually, there's a kind of a laneway up at the Memorial, is that called Memorial Park? Like there's all these little things that were done years and years ago to connect Duckworth to water. And we've got to, there's got to be initiatives to start causing these spaces to go back the other way, meaning claiming them back and cleaning them up and making them be responsible for the general public.
And I guess Grant, you've got a comment on maybe what's starting to happen in this space. I know it's one of the favorite little landing spots.
Well, this particular area is now going to become, I think it's Bank of Montreal. It's a Bank of Montreal building. And again, I think the initiative comes from like-minded people who care about the city and care about the larger problems of the city. But for instance, from my point of view, any new building that would be placed on Water Street absolutely has to create a public zone that you can walk through and get out on Harbour. Right now, there's historical precedence for this, because any building that was on water before Atlantic Place, and actually the building that Atlantic Place tore down to create Atlantic Place, all of those buildings, basically there were the merchants, and of course the wooden ships were right behind them. Harbour Drive didn't exist. They all had portals, and there's only 2 portals left. One of them is in the Fanning building across from the Craft Council, and then across from Solomon's Lane. And then the other one is Solomon's Lane, which we call Graffiti Alley now. But those are original portals that the merchants used, and the suppliers and all that stuff, to get down to the wooden ships, because you're not going to walk all the way to the end of the block and go around. So there's already precedent of how to use our urban space. But any new building that's put in, the city has definite rules of setbacks and heights and loads of rules. I don't know why we don't have a rule that says absolutely you have to provide a way to get through your building publicly and be able to get access to not only harbor but also water. And it does a lot of things. It allows the phenomena of Montreal, where you can get out of the weather and actually be inside buildings that are all laced together, was not something that, it happened as a mistake on the first project in the 70s. And then they began to realize that this was a definite pedestrian pathway that could exist. And there's it's an immense amount of miles of pedestrian pathway that's in what's called underground Montreal. Well, in our case, we have weather the same way. Why can't our buildings start lacing themselves together? But it comes from a mandate from the city's regulations. what happens is that these developers just get basically to do what they want, and they end up not really. We end up having another Atlantic Place where it's a beautiful entrance from water. You can walk in it. It in many times has wonderful activity, food court, and you go outside and you want to continue onto Harbour, and you can't get off the deck.
No, those are good points. And Grant, I guess now that we're coming on the hour, I'm trying to switch this. Now that we're coming on the hour, were there any other points you wanted to stop on before we shut down for the day?
The only other point I want to make is everyone's familiar with Scotia Bank, and actually it was John and myself and a group of people under the brand of I Buy Local, where we actually designed a Saturday last summer. We designed a Saturday of a different way of using downtown. What's funny about it is that most people didn't know that we designed it. But one key thing that came out of that was the people that program the use of Scotia Bank, and there are responsible parties, they had designed the building that it had outside public space that was supposed to be used for something. As far as I know, it was never used for anything until we brought African dance to be, we'll say, presented to the public, because the public is walking on the sidewalk and whatever, and realize this is Scotia's property, but it's meant to be a public space. And I think there has to be a responsibility that the people like Scotia Bank are responsible for activating those spaces once in a while, or programming them properly, or engaging other parties of the city to come use my space. If we don't do that, if they're not programmed properly and initiatives don't get created, we end up with them as dead urban space. And basically, most of the time, that Scotia area, which, by the way, does have a staircase that goes down to Harbour, it's most of the time, all the time, from what I know, never used. I think we were the only people that ever used it so far. And
well, maybe
that has to be a partnership.
Yeah, and maybe we'll finish up on that, because it was interesting, back to the point of I Buy Local, how we activated this space of Ayers Lane, which I'm not sure. I mean, until we did that, I wasn't quite familiar with all these little side walkways on downtown, and it was cool to light that up and have people gather around and watch these performances. What was really neat, back to the point of what we did in this square, is it was nothing really that was, blocked off. It was happening through a regular day. We didn't look to get any closures, but we had a great, I don't know if you can hear me, because the wind is absolutely intense down here right now.
We're hearing.
I'm gonna go on this little, but anyway, this whole square here, we had probably about, 25 African dancers.
Yep.
Well, not just African. It was a number of different ethnic groups that came down and did their, native dance routines, we'll say. And it was amazing. It just kind of popped up. And that was kind of the spirit of the whole day, was just things happening without shutting anything down necessarily. What are some of the activities that we can do without necessarily having to go through the process of city approval and whatnot? Like, what is the intention of these spaces like this square, and how can it be activated or lit up or programmed, as you might say, for just cool things happening? And it was great. We probably had, on that day, fortunately, the weather was amazing, and we had a lot of folks coming around. And I'd say at any given time, there was maybe 50, 60 people, like passerbyers, that would just stop, say, hey, what's going on? And end up not just recording what was going on, but a couple got involved and actually started dancing with these performers, which was incredible. So I think if we aim to do more things like that, or of that nature, where it's what can we do just as, with public spaces, that you don't necessarily have to have anything large, but just activities that could be programmed in a way that just gets something happening in a certain space and create energy and excitement.
Yeah. See, Scotia spent money to design this outside space. It was actually a mandate given to the architects, because I know the architect that did Scotia. The space is created, but it can't just stop there. There's got to be some responsible parties to continue to program it, to continue to activate it.
And I mean, the cool thing is what helped for those performances. There's power out here for these cars, so they plugged in their amps and their speakers, and were able to, you know, really light the space up, which was cool.
Yeah. Another, just to stay with this thread a minute, but it's an opposite problem. On George Street, because we're so focused on George Street has to have the George Street Festival, what happens is that temporary stages get put up on George Street. And then, because no one's really caring about our public zone, our public area, because we have been living mostly inside, right? But if we could activate more to the outside and start claiming this, it would force more like a cleanup of George Street, because I think we didn't walk through there, but there's so much apparatus that is left for the next George Street Festival. And that shouldn't be the case. Either the urban zones that they're using, because they're using the public zones, should be invested into to allow George Street Festival to happen. But when it's not happening, it's a wonderful public space, rather than what's happening now, which is, the George Street Festival happens and then we get to look at all the trash. And that's not claiming public area or taking care of it.
Yeah, so I guess at the end of the day, if nothing else, the whole purpose of this whole walk, I guess, is to more or less highlight the really unique things that we have in this city. Even just from the quick hour walk that we did today, lots of really interesting spaces that we can, activate or do different community activities in. And any closing comments, Grant?
Let's just keep on going.
Keep on going. And I will put it out there. Grant talked a little bit about I Buy Local and what we had done last summer. We are planning for, I guess, 2020, more of an I Am Local focus, but you can stay tuned, and we'd be happy to send along information if you want to share related to how that ties into urban planning and the dynamic of St. John's, and how we can all get involved.